Nyali, Banjalangi, Rakol Jugun. Nyali Gani Garama, Mala Jugun.
Fired up. Take a breath, take a breath. Okay. Jonathan Crowe, our speaker this evening, is Professor of Law at Bond University and one of Australia's leading legal philosophers. His research interests are focused on the philosophical relationship between law and ethics, with particular reference to the nature and foundations of legal obligation and the role of ethics in legal reasoning. He has published widely on natural law theory and existentialist ethics, particularly the work of Emmanuel Levinas. He has also published research on ethical and doctrinal issues in a range of fields of law, including constitutional law, international humanitarian law, criminal law, family law, corporations law, competitive law, and dispute resolution. Jonathan is the author of several books and more than 60 book chapters and journal articles. Currently, Jonathan is completing a book on the natural law tradition in ethics and jurisprudence. As if all this wasn't enough, Jonathan is also the current president of the Australian Society of Legal Philosophy and a former convener of the Australian Dispute Resolution Research Network. Happily for us, this is not Jonathan's first visit to the politics in the pub. He's seen us in action before. I think we were largely well behaved. We're delighted and honoured to know that Jonathan is a supporter of the Ngara Institute and its dedication to critical thought. It's great to have such a distinguished scholar amongst us here tonight. Please give a warm Mullumbimby welcome to Jonathan Crowe.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction and that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about anarchy. I'd like to thank Richard and the Ngara Institute for inviting me and all of you for coming along this evening. Some of you might recall that a few weeks ago, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott was in the headlines when he claimed to have been headbutted while campaigning in Hobart. And the assailant was identified as a local Hobart DJ, Astro Lay, who described himself to the media as a lone anarchist. And he went on to say, for all intents and purposes legally, I'm remorseful. I quite like that phrase. For all intents and purposes legally, I'm remorseful.
Keep going, just forget I'm not in. Pretend I'm not in, that's it.
He said, I felt the need to headbutt Tony Abbott because I didn't feel it was an opportunity I'd get again. Now, look, as someone sympathetic to anarchism myself, I must admit to feeling somewhat dismayed by Mr. Lay's comments. Although I can readily understand why someone might feel tempted to headbutt Tony Abbott, if I was the sort of person who would go around headbutting people, he would probably be fairly high on my list. But I'm a man of peace. I don't condone that sort of behaviour. And more importantly, this is the sort of thing that gives anarchism a bad name. So there's a popular perception of anarchism as a lawless or even violent philosophy. And when people think of anarchists, they often think of masked revolutionaries, or perhaps teenagers with a penchant for black clothes, punk music and piercings. But one of the things I want to do this evening is try to dispel that perception. I want to argue that in reality, anarchism is a peaceful philosophy. It opposes centralised government, not because of a desire for law breaking and chaos, but because local and voluntary cooperation is the best way to organise communities. So I want to say a few things about what anarchism means as a political philosophy, and I also want to talk about why I think anarchism is relevant for Australian politics today. And I'm going to focus on some aspects of anarchist philosophies that are of interest to me, but it's a very broad tradition, a very diverse school of thought, and I look forward to hearing from all of you later on what anarchism means to you. So because I'm a trained philosopher, I'm going to start out by drawing a few fine and technical distinctions. And I'm also a lawyer, which only makes things worse, I'm afraid. So I'm going to start by distinguishing three different ways of understanding anarchism as a political theory. So the first possibility is what I'm going to call substantive anarchism. And we can define this as the view that the state, or if you like, centralised government, is unjustified and should be abolished. So that's the substantive claim of anarchism as a political philosophy. Now personally I think substantive anarchism is pretty plausible, but there are two problems when you set out to defend that claim. The first is that it's pretty hard to prove, because it's hard to know exactly what would happen if the state was abolished in a society like contemporary Australia. There's just not much empirical evidence that you can go on. And we can talk about hypotheses and advanced theories about what might happen, but in the end it's all pretty speculative. And discussing historical examples, which are beloved of anarchist theorists, like medieval Iceland, for example, only gets you so far when you're talking about Australia today. So this makes it hard to know. Would we be better off in reality if the state was abolished or not? So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the state is very unlikely to be abolished in the near future. And so this makes discussions of anarchism seem highly abstract, and it might seem that it has little relevance to political issues today. And so for this reason, substantive anarchism, as I've described it, may be of most interest to political philosophers, but there are at least two other ways of understanding anarchism which I think have direct implications for contemporary Australian politics. And that's what I want to focus on next. So the second option is what I'm going to call methodological anarchism. And the basic idea is to think about anarchism as a method that you can apply when you're thinking about or responding to political issues. So the idea is that when you're considering a political question, you can begin by asking not how could the government solve this problem, but rather how would I and the other members of my community solve this problem if the government didn't exist to help me? So that's the question we can all ask ourselves. And the benefit of methodological anarchism is that it makes us less reliant in our thinking and in our action on centralised government to solve our problems. Instead, it strengthens and empowers local communities by encouraging us to think about local and cooperative solutions. So just for one example, let's take the current issue in Australia of affordable housing. So one way we can respond to this issue is ask what policies could the government adopt to solve this problem. But I think we have to face reality here, that the government is not very likely to solve the housing affordability crisis. And one reason for this is that many government ministers who are in charge of directing policy on this issue own multiple investment properties themselves. So what they want is for housing prices to go up, not down. So methodological anarchism suggests that we ask a different question. Instead of looking to the government, we could ask ourselves, what can we do as a community to ease the pressure on housing? And there are a range of possible solutions we might come up with. So just as one example is the idea of community land trusts. So these are not-for-profit community organisations that acquire property for the purpose of sustainable housing, and residents can then acquire their homes from the trust on long-term leases, with resale prices capped at an affordable level, by reference to local wages, for example. Another possible solution is for individual landowners to think about the way they manage their own properties. Can they put them to use to benefit the community rather than trying to resell them and make a profit? And so at that individual level, everybody can make a difference to these kinds of social issues. As Leo Tolstoy put it, everyone thinks of changing the world, but nobody thinks of changing themselves. So the idea here is that changing the world is hard, but you can do it one person at a time and start with yourself. Methodological anarchism then helps to generate innovative solutions to political questions, and in particular it helps to reframe political discussions away from party politics and centralised government and towards more local community-driven solutions. And I suggest that that approach is highly relevant to Australian politics today. But what if you would like to change traditional party politics rather than just bypassing it and inventing local alternatives? And this brings me to the third possible way of understanding anarchism, which I'm going to call strategic anarchism. So strategic anarchism involves adopting anarchism as a way of influencing mainstream politics. The idea is that by arguing that the state should be abolished, you at least force people to think seriously about community-based alternatives to current policies. Now, the risk of strategic anarchism is that people may think your views are unrealistic or too radical, but I think if you can prompt even a few people to take anarchism seriously, start thinking about what it means and how it can be made to work, you can open up new dialogues, new ideas, new possibilities that they would otherwise never have considered. So that's the value in strategic anarchism. So I've set it up, I think, about the different meanings of anarchism, and in the rest of my talk I want to consider two further questions. So the first is, why is the anarchist alternative worth considering? What's wrong with current arrangements? And the second question is, what might a stateless society actually look like? So the first question requires us to compare anarchism with the dominant alternative, which is centralised government by nation states. And I think we have to be careful here not to prejudge the issue by the way that we describe the different options. So anarchists, I think, are sometimes guilty of this. One minute they're attacking the state in a very pessimistic way, pointing out all of its worst aspects, while the next minute they're painting a very rosy and optimistic picture of what would happen in a stateless utopia. But opponents of anarchism equally make the same mistake. They often seem to take a very optimistic view of what centralised government can achieve, while assuming that anarchy will automatically bring out the worst in human nature. So the challenge, I think, is to take a realistic point of view on both alternatives. We want to ask realistically, how well does the state perform, considering both its advantages and its disadvantages? And we also want to ask, what would a stateless society look like, given a realistic picture of human nature? Now, in order to answer the first question, how well is the state performing, we need to ask, what is the state for? Why do we have centralised government in the first place? And there are many possible answers that might be given to this question, but a plausible one, I think, is that the state exists to keep us safe from violence and to protect the most vulnerable members of the community. So we can ask, how well has the nation-state advanced these goals? And it seems that the report card would be a poor one. Violence, inequality and poverty continue to be widespread under the modern state. Access to education and healthcare has improved over time, but it remains far from universal. Now, it might seem that in a country like Australia, the state has largely succeeded in keeping violence in check, but this needs to be balanced against the state's track record of actively perpetrating violence against the most vulnerable members of the community. So armed conflict is perhaps the most obvious example of this. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, have killed countless innocent civilians. And these deaths may not have been directly perpetrated by Australians, but our government helped to make them possible. And other examples can be found closer to home. So the Australian government has a long track record of incarcerating its most disadvantaged citizens, many of them for non-violent crimes. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners represent around 27% of the Australian adult prison population, despite accounting for only 2% of the general community. So it's often thought that throwing people in jail is necessary to maintain social order. It's the price we have to pay in order to keep ourselves safe. that imprisoning people is a catastrophically bad way of ensuring their compliance with social norms. The percentage of prisoners in Australia who return to jail within 1 year of release is around 40%. It's not for no reason that Michel Foucault remarked that prison is a recruitment centre for the army of crime. And a related issue concerns the Australian government's policy of mandatory detention for asylum seekers. And this policy has given rise to well-documented suffering and abuses, most recently at the offshore detention centres on Nauru and Manus Island. And I think these examples reveal an underlying fact about the institution of the state, which is that the state itself is premised on violence. So Max Weber famously defined the state as a human community that successfully claims monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within its territory. So this is the way the state operates. Putting someone in prison, for example, is a violent and coercive act, and as such it's no surprise that it leads in many cases to further violence. One person feels disempowered and takes revenge on someone else, who in turn feels disempowered and seeks revenge, which leads to a continuing cycle of disempowerment and violence. And it's this cycle that we want to try to break, I think, by introducing anarchist ideas into discussion. So the state may keep some people safe from violence, but it actively perpetrates violence against others. What about the goal of social equality? Does the state protect the vulnerable by making people more equal? And the evidence suggests not. Economic inequality has generally risen significantly in Western democracies over the last few decades. So if the purpose of the state is to make people more equal, then it seems to have been a resounding failure. Indeed, there are many ways that the state exacerbates inequality by reinforcing existing power structures. The state itself, the mechanism of government, tends to be controlled by the privileged and powerful, so it's no surprise that they have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are. And the issue of the cost of housing in Australia is a good example. There are things the government could do to make housing more affordable, but this would likely mean a decrease in property prices, which the government wants to avoid. And this is partly because many of the government's own members own multiple investment properties, but it's also because they want the support of property-owning voters. The composition of the government therefore combines with the electoral system to entrench the interests of property owners over those who can't get into the market. But this amounts to protecting the privileged at the expense of the vulnerable. There are numerous other examples, but the underlying problem is that the rich and powerful have the ability to influence government policies in a way that the vulnerable and disadvantaged do not, and this entrenches existing power disparities. So there's reason to think that the state has failed in its central objectives. Rather than keeping people safe, it actively perpetrates violence against some of its most disadvantaged citizens. And instead of protecting the vulnerable, it entrenches or exacerbates current inequalities. So the next question is, what would happen if the state was abolished? How would society be organised in the absence of government institutions? Now, at this point, we can identify two general ways that social problems might be solved in a stateless society: by non-profit local community initiatives, or by services provided on the free market. And anarchists are sometimes divided into camps depending on what kind of solutions they emphasise. So non-market anarchists emphasise voluntary and non-profit solutions, while market anarchists emphasise the role of entrepreneurs and small businesses in filling these social needs. And I tend to think that what would happen and what would be the best solution is a combination of those two approaches. Indeed, it seems to me that in a stateless society, there would be less of a distinction between those two categories than might appear to be the case today. So contemporary economic markets tend to be dominated by large corporations and businesses focused on accumulating capital. So this makes it appear that the free market necessarily leads to aggressive pursuit of the profit motive. But it's worth remembering here that corporations were created by the state. Without the protection of corporations law, corporations as we know them would not exist. Anarchist theorists therefore often distinguish between markets and capitalism. So one possible solution here, but we might put forward along anarchist lines, is abolish the corporations law and free up the market to play more of a constructive role in offering local solutions to social problems. So markets are not necessarily bad. When you go to the local farmers market and buy fresh produce, you're engaging in a market transaction. They can be valuable means of social cooperation, but it's the concentration of power in large corporations that tends to distort markets by making them vehicles for accruing capital. So I think anarchism has something important to say about that issue. So another distinction which is sometimes drawn is between right-wing and left-wing forms of anarchism. And this distinction is mainly about the reasons a person might have for being an anarchist. So right-wing anarchists are drawn to anarchism because they value individual liberty. They think anarchy will make people more independent and self-reliant by freeing them from the fetters of state control and regulation. Whereas left-wing anarchists, on the other hand, tend to be more concerned with the impact of the state on the vulnerable. They're drawn to anarchism due to its power, its potential to empower local communities and reduce economic inequalities. And you might be able to get the sense from what I've said so far that left-wing anarchism is more attractive to me. I think individual liberty is important, but the strongest case for anarchism, in my view, comes from its potential to reduce inequality and improve the position of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in the community. So I want to conclude my comments this evening by discussing 3 potential advantages of anarchy that we might want to consider. First, anarchy is order. Second, anarchy is peaceful. Third, anarchy is equality. So anarchist theorists have long argued that anarchy is order. There's a popular perception of anarchy as a state of chaos or lawlessness, but this is unlikely to be what actually happens. Rather, a stateless society will be governed by customary law and evolved social norms, as opposed to the coercive law imposed by the state. So this raises the question, why would people obey the law in a customary legal system? And the answer to this question partly depends on the broader question, why do people obey the law today? This is something worth thinking about. The vast majority of people in Australia obey the law the vast majority of the time. But it's hard to explain this if you just look at the formal enforcement mechanisms associated with the state. So the total proportion of the population, whoever appears in court for a criminal offence, is fairly low, but most people who have never been in court and never had any contact with the formal legal system nonetheless follow the law. So it might be said that it's the threat of sanctions, the threat of legal action that keeps people in line. But there are plenty of opportunities to commit crimes without much fear of being caught. Petty theft, for example, remains relatively uncommon, despite the frequency with which people leave their belongings unattended. The vast majority of people simply pass up opportunities they have to commit crimes. Now, what about those members of the community who don't have a law-abiding attitude? What about people who don't respect the law? But I think this is an area where we have to take a realistic comparison between the stateless society and the current alternative. It's not clear why this problem will be any worse under anarchy than it is today. And one reason for that is that a range of local security services would likely arise in order to deal with these types of problems on a more local and cooperative level. So anarchy is order. Secondly, anarchy is peaceful. So the state, as I've said, is defined by its claim to exercise a monopoly over violence. The law of the state resembles the classic definition of law given by the English philosopher John Austin, the commands of a sovereign backed up by sanctions. So the way that the state keeps order and organises the community is typically to use sanctions to force people to do its bidding. And in general terms, that's just not a very nice way to behave. It's also unnecessary insofar as communities would work just as well, or perhaps better, without it. So the state is unjust insofar as it forces people, without good reason, to do its bidding by using force and violence. So in a stateless society, the idea is people would be more likely to cooperate on a local level to solve community problems rather than relying on the government. Disputes, for example, will be settled by negotiation, mediation and other voluntary methods, which, when you think about it, is exactly how most disputes are resolved today. And these informal processes are quicker, less expensive and often more equitable than formal courtroom processes. So the third claim I want to advance is that anarchy is equality. Now, I said before that one of the aims of the state is meant to be to protect the vulnerable. However, the state has consistently failed to reduce social and economic inequalities. Rather, these have increased over time. So why might we think that a stateless society would do a better job of reducing inequality? One reason is that the state actively discriminates against disadvantaged members of the community. It throws them in jail in disproportionate numbers. It controls their lives by providing welfare payments, then attaching onerous conditions and bureaucratic requirements. It prevents them from entering lucrative jobs and professions by imposing regulations and high barriers to entry. So the welfare state is supposed to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. But the upper and middle class also consume a significant share of government services. And in fact, the very rich can often avoid paying tax entirely by making use of corporations, trusts and other tax concessions and loopholes. And in fact, corporations and the rich often lobby the state for special subsidies, like the potential $1 billion government loan from taxpayer money being proposed for the Adani coal mine. So the massive economic influence of the state leads to a concentration of power, and that concentration of power tends to benefit the wealthy and the privileged. So economic power in a stateless society would be likely to be more dispersed throughout the community simply because that centralised monopoly doesn't exist. But what about those who can't afford to pay for goods and services? Well, you might expect services to arise at a variety of price points, a wider variety than today, particularly if regulatory barriers are removed. And people might also be expected to band together in their communities to subsidise the less wealthy through cooperative and pro bono programs. So rather than saying that's the government's problem to help the least advantaged in the community, it will become an issue for local communities to confront on their own terms. Nonetheless, there will probably still be gaps in access to services in a stateless society, and there would no doubt be inequalities. Rich communities would tend to have better services than poor ones. But it's important to remember that every known economic system has gaps and inequalities, and it's not as if there are no gaps in the state. For example, many people can't afford to access the state legal system. Indeed, the least vulnerable, or the most vulnerable, are often the least able to get legal representation and a fair hearing in the courtroom. So it seems at least possible that access to law and justice would be more equitable under anarchy. Market incentives would exist for state service providers to emerge in poor communities, and the result will be imperfect because humans are imperfect and our communities are imperfect. But the question is, could it be better than what we have now? So I've argued that anarchy stands for order, not chaos. It stands for peace, not violence. It stands for equality, not entrenching privilege for the wealthy few. It argues for consensual and localised responses to social challenges, rather than the coercive and centralised solutions that tend to dominate politics today. So the state, as I said at the start, is not likely to be abolished in the near future. But what I'm suggesting is we could all benefit from imagining what a stateless society would be like and opening a dialogue about innovative local responses to community issues. And it's for that reason that I say that anarchism has a useful role to play in Australian politics today. So my message is that it's okay to be an anarchist. Yeah. It's not just for violent revolutionaries or goth teenagers, and it doesn't mean you're about to headbutt somebody, as tempting as that sometimes may be. Thank you very much.
Okay. Are you ready?
Oh yeah.
We're going to go into groups to form methodological anarchism in our anarchic huddles in an orderly, peaceful and equal way. Okay? So, bear with me on this. This is different, I know, but I think it's going to be fun. So, we're going to put the house lights up, please, Ralph. House lights up for 10 minutes. I'm going to set my clock. In 5 minutes, I'm going to want you to have come up with the beginning of a question, and after the 5-minute call, I want you to allocate your spokesperson. 6 groups in the room. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? Go! Anarchy!
Taking back power, decision-making. So what could you do as an individual, which is an anarchist act?
Thank you for everybody. Thank you, everybody. Can I have the spokesperson for each group put their hand up, please? 1. Spokesperson over here, anybody? No?
Can you hear me? Our question is, where is anarchy working collectively at present, and what were the first steps that achieved it?
I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the difficulties in discussing anarchy is that it's hard to point to anywhere around the world today where you can say, here is a society operating wholly on anarchist principles, and that's how it would work, say, in Australia. That's one of the problems that we face. But I also think that if you look at the way that communities work, in ways that don't depend on the institutions of government, there are lots of institutions of anarchy which exist in our communities today. If you look at the way that people solve their legal disputes, there are very few legal disputes that end up in the courtroom. So how do people resolve them? They have negotiations with each other. If they can't work it out informally, they might go to a mediator, they might try some other form of organised dispute resolution, and the courtroom is a last resort. So the state doesn't get involved in people's disputes unless it gets to a really serious level. And so all those ways that we organise ourselves informally, cooperatively with each other, without relying on the government, those are the things that would drive the community under anarchy, and that's where our examples come from, I think.
Is Syria in anarchy now?
Well, see, I think that you can point to Syria, you can point to Somalia, which I think was the closest thing that we had to a truly stateless society internationally a few years back. But I don't think those are reliable guides to what would happen in Australia if the state was abolished, because it very much depends on the social norms and the social capital and the institutions you have in a particular society. So I think it's safer to look at the way things actually do work in Australia and ask how those things would change if the state was removed.
Great. Next question, please.
There's been quite a lot of discussion about a universal income for every single person. It's happening around the world, there's these talks. Do you think that that will lead to some form of, lead us closer to some form of anarchy?
Well, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea of a universal basic income. If you're talking about a universal basic income provided by the government, it's not exactly an anarchist initiative. But the advantage of it, I think, is that it reduces the control that the bureaucratic state has over people's lives. And so to that extent, it's an anarchist idea, because the state is still involved, but not involved in a very interventionist and coercive way, rather just involved in redistributing wealth and giving people the means of a basic existence. So that's why I think that idea has some resonance with anarchist initiatives.
Given that you've described that anarchism as the difference between the state and local self-organised groups, the question is the CWA an anarchist organisation?
Well, that's a terrific question. I think, I think strangely enough it is, in the sense that all local community organisations, whatever kind they may be, are representing these sorts of anarchist principles, the potential of civic organisations to play perhaps more effectively the role that we often attribute to the government. So I think you're certainly onto something there.
Next question. Okay. Thank you.
We're a pretty anarchic table and we have 2 questions and 2 propositions. So the first question is, how do you get people to agree at a community level? And the second is, how do you get big projects delivered without a state in the absence of a bigger organisation, larger scale organisation than the community level? And I guess our propositions are, well, we have 2 propositions. One is that we can perceive a system of systems. For example, we're working towards that in this region through energy, so that we're saying this region could be self-sustainable in terms of its energy needs, and we're working on ways of delivering that. But there is still a need, even within energy, which we could make to take advantage of existing state systems, which is, you don't want to completely disregard transmission, you just want to minimise it. So that you take advantage of what is already being built up, but you make sure that you use as little of it as possible in order to minimise costs and to deliver what you can through the regional community. So that's your system of systems approach. How do you see that? If you completely dismantle a state, how does that work? The other proposition was we should get all politicians to sign, instead of a Bill of Rights, that we should get all politicians to sign an agreement that, a scorecard, that they are going to do what their community wants. And that if that is delivered, we will then effectively get what they sign up for, what the community wants. But again, that implies that you still have the political overarching system. Okay, let's forward.
That's excellent, thank you. On the first question, how do you get people to agree? I think what you want is a system where you don't have to get everyone to agree, because you're never going to have a situation where everybody in a community agrees on everything, or even on some of the most important issues. So you want a system where you have a set of rules which are general enough and open-ended enough that people can pursue their different lives and put into practice their different priorities and pursue different initiatives in the community without having to agree with each other all the time. And I think one of the problems with current party politics and the current state system is that you have this one institution that has a monopoly over this coercive power. And if you have a situation where not everyone agrees, then invariably some people are going to go unrepresented and other people are going to have that mechanism of the state backing their ideas. So there's a sense in which anarchy is, I think, more democratic because it allows for this likelihood that people won't always agree. Now, on the other issue of large infrastructure programs and the like, so I think this is a good question. I'm not sure I have a foolproof answer. How would a stateless society have something like a national highway network? It would have to start from scratch. It would have to be through local communities devising their own road systems and then communicating with each other to have an integrated national network. But luckily in Australia, if we're putting forward these anarchist ideas, as you said, what we're talking about is abolishing the state, but we're not talking about going back in time and making it a state that never existed. One way to think about the state is it's like scaffolding. It's scaffolding like when you're teaching somebody something, but when they reach a certain level, you take the scaffold away. And we can think about the state like that, I think.
Could AI replace government in meeting people's needs equally?
Hold the microphone.
I'll repeat that. I'm getting guidance here. To what extent could AI, that's artificial intelligence, replace governments in meeting people's needs equally, or in terms of methodological anarchy, in the interest of self-empowerment and self-regulation, should we leave that to a democratic process? In other words, cooperation rather than competition.
That's fascinating. I think in relation to AI, I mean, to what extent AI can replace government, I'm not sure how I would answer that. But I think something that's relevant to our discussion of anarchy is that the technological advances that we've seen in sharing information and communicating with each other across large distances can only make anarchy more feasible, I think, because it makes it less likely that we actually need this centralised institution to coordinate our communication with each other, when we can do that dynamically by using the internet and electronic media. So that's not quite what you asked, but that's an answer to a related question which I would prefer to answer. What was the second question? I forget. Oh, sorry.
I'll do my best, guys. Or in terms of methodological anarchy, in the interests of self-empowerment, ecology, self-empowerment and self-regulation, should we leave that to a democratic process? In other words, cooperation rather than competition.
Well, I think that what we're talking about in a way is if we understand the democratic process in a narrow sense as the electoral system, the way we elect our government representatives, if we understand it that way, we're talking about bypassing that system. We're talking about things we could do on our own without having to go through the democratic system. What I talked about is strategic anarchy. It's more about how we might represent anarchist ideas through the democratic process. But I think there's another sense in which methodological anarchism is more democratic than the current electoral process, because it's a local community-based type of philosophy. And if you're working things out in local communities, then it's more likely people will have a real say than if you're just electing someone to Parliament in Canberra.
Next question. Who's
It's working. As you're advocating for a devolution of responsibility or power to a more local level, what would be your thoughts to, on a local level, it's not Somalia, so you may not have warlords taking over, but in Australia we have corrupt local governments. I'm not saying Warren Shire, but there are many examples of a local body going way off the rails, and that's often cited as a reason for a overarching body to solve the problem. That's the question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that obviously we can't expect local organisations or local politics to be perfect. Anyone who's been involved in a local community organisation knows that that's far from being the case. So the question is more, given that humans are imperfect, given that we're not always going to act as we should, what is the best system for managing that imperfection? And it just seems to me that all things being equal, it's more dangerous to have a centralised government and to have imperfect people and corrupt people in charge of that than it is to have localised politics and localised governance and corrupted, imperfect people in charge of that. So it's not that we're assuming people are going to be perfect. quite the contrary. We're assuming that people are flawed and imperfect, and we're trying to work with that reality. That's how I would see it.
My question, over here. Yeah. There's a couple at this table. One is, does the word anarchism itself get in the way of, and the popular associations with that get in the way of people considering it rationally and thinking about whether it's actually possible. But the other question is, what does social psychology have to say to anarchism? We were discussing that there is probably a limit to the amount of people we can actually negotiate with and the amount of people we consider as we. So let's just take and the amount of people that one can actually trustingly negotiate with, social psychology says is about 150, which is very small. So, for example, but suppose that we could manage in a shire the size of Byron Shire to negotiate the very first problem that you'd have to deal with, I think, if you took away the state, which would be a living wage for everyone, some way of support. And we're one of the smaller shires around, so perhaps we would get that done faster, and our neighbouring shires didn't. Would we then be having to set up border protection? I don't know.
So on that first point about the connotations of the word anarchism, I'm sort of in two minds about this. On the one hand, a lot of what we've been talking about tonight, you could use some other label. You could talk about devolution of power, you could talk about localism, there are many other terms you could use, civil society, those sorts of terms. But the value in using the term anarchism, I think, is that you sort of, by jolting people out of their comfort zone and making them think about that term, sometimes you could open up new ways of thinking that they wouldn't be exposed to if we talked about it in some other way. So basically I think there's value in being a bit provocative, trying to directly confront the negative connotations of the term in order to try and get people to think in new ways. Now this other question about suppose you have a local community and you negotiate something, how do you deal with people moving in and out of that community and disrupting your system? Oh, social psychologists, yes. Well, I'm no expert on that, but my understanding is that in terms of the size of the group that people can build trust within, that they can effectively negotiate within, that aspect of social psychology would support a more locally oriented approach to politics. But I'm not sure I'm qualified to say more than that about the social psychology of it. Yeah. This question of what local communities in a stateless society would do about people wanting to exit or enter the community is not something I'm sure I have a fair view about. I think that's an interesting question, except to say that it would be something that, well, it would be like any question where the local community has to discuss that among themselves and work out how they want to deal with it. Do they want to try and police some sort of border to their local community? Or do they want to try and have some transitional mechanism to help new entrants become part of a community? There are all sorts of options, and it would be up to the local community to decide.
Hi. Our table's question is very similar to the other question about corruption, so I'll make it a little bit more specific and ask, under anarchy, if you happen to have one of those communities that have a very charismatic, power-hungry, egotistical, greedy person become the person who's controlling that community, you were saying that it could be in the big picture, it's a sacrifice that might be worth making, but for that community, it's not so great. How would you, in that community, under anarchy, deal with that situation?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. I think there's two things I would say about that. The first is sort of tying back to what I said about the previous question. I think we shouldn't deny that that might happen, but I think it's probably less likely that that would happen under a devolved system of power than it is under the current system, because the more power that institution has, the more incentive a corrupt person has to seize control of that institution. So in that sense, there would be less incentive for someone to try and dominate a local community than when you have a governance body that has a monopoly over coercive power. Perhaps another thing we can say about that is that if you're in a country like Australia and the government is taken over by corrupt influences, there's not much you can do about that in terms of exiting the community. It's very hard for many people to move around internationally and leave a country if they don't agree with the way it's being run. But the advantage of having more local communities would be if a particular community is not being well run, it would be easier. I'm not saying there wouldn't be difficulties people would confront, but it would be easier for people to be more mobile and vote with their feet and go where there's a well-run community. And that in turn would reduce the incentive that corrupt people have to take control of the community, because if they do that, people might just leave. So it doesn't abolish that problem, but there are some ways in which it might mitigate that problem, and that's what we're trying to do, I think. These are fantastic questions, thanks.
Yeah, hello there. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for coming down to Mullumbimby. It's so good to see the place full. And yeah, it's fantastic just not to be scouring the internet for such conversation and debate. So it's fantastic to see faces in the pub and discussing ways forward that can break the chains of oppression that we're currently under. I have a question though, as a living, breathing anarchist. It seems to me that for 45 years there's been so far that you can take the ideals under the regimes that we have, capitalism, power hierarchy, and then you sort of come to a full stop. You know, you get hit by the authoritative stroke or the naughty boy doing too much or asking too much. So on a ground level and the community level and in the house and small business and avoiding property and not working too hard or not too much for the man, you can take all these things on and make a go of life. But my question is, there's an old anarchist mantra that goes along the premise, something along the lines of that ultimately freedom can't be given, it has to be taken. And I ask this because if we're working off this premise that it can't come from above down, which we're ultimately seeing now with the takeover of renewable energy companies and Bitcoin by the Chinese government and any form of other alternative looking ways forward being hijacked by yet another corporate organisation, is there a way to be able to reclaim our lives without revolution, without violence? And if you believe that there is a way, I'd like to hear from you how you think that could be done on a larger level, because they're not going to give their power away easily, are they?
Yeah, I think you've expressed that very nicely. I think that one of the attractions of anarchism, at least for me, I think for many people, is that, well, the way that mainstream politics is going at the moment is very discouraging. And anarchism offers a way of thinking about politics which is an alternative. It enables you to think about politics on a more individual or more local level. You can almost, to a certain extent, ignore what's going on in Canberra and try to make a difference in your own life and in the lives of people you know. And that might be a more optimistic and a more hopeful way to live your life. But the danger of that, of course, is that it becomes a sort of fatalism or a sort of quietism where you're just opting out of your chance to influence the broader system by focusing on your own life and your local solutions. And I think this is a very old dilemma that philosophers have struggled with for a long time. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that except to say that I think it's a matter for all of us to try and strike a balance which is right for us, to do the best we can to focus on our own lives and the people we know and local solutions, also do what we can to change the broader political system. Whether a violent revolution is the way to go, I'm not sure, because of course the thing about that is it always has side effects and costs which may outweigh the gains that you make. And what are you going to end up with on the other side? Are you going to end up with a true anarchistic society or just another sort of centralised state?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, thank you. You all did really well. I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad that you're on my team in the revolution. You all did really, really well. How was it for you? Was it okay? Did you cope? Having to talk to each other and get organised? Because this is what the revolution's going to look like, people. We're going to have to huddle in groups. Thank you, Jonathan Crowe, for coming and seeing us.
Thank you, Sally. And above all, thank you to Professor Jonathan Crowe for being here tonight. There's two brief things I want to say is this. Many of you would have thought when you looked at the poster, what on earth is a professor of law doing talking about anarchy? I must admit, that crossed my mind actually. But there's two things about that. One is that academics play a key role in the activist agenda. Without academics playing that key role in terms of providing the analytical frameworks through which we can actually understand ideas and propositions more clearly, we really would be of a lesser, suffering a little bit from that. So I really want to kind of recommend that we all rethink the role of academics in the activist movement. Some of the best academics I know are actually activists, and I'm thinking here of Noam Chomsky, for example. Brilliant academic, brilliant scholar, brilliant activist. They are part of the movement. The other thing I want to say is this. One of the reasons why people the rich and powerful in particular, are so terrified of the idea of anarchism is not because it's about people in caped cloaks carrying little bombs and assassinating people. It's because they can't tolerate the idea of local autonomies and ordinary people doing things for themselves. The rich and the powerful have been historically accustomed to dominating the working classes, the poor, the marginalised, and sitting on top of those hierarchical structures. That's what anarchism is essentially about. It's also about a proposition around human nature. For the conservative side of politics, it actually means that they regard human nature and human beings essentially as greedy, avaricious, competitive creatures, all out for themselves. That's the libertarian idea. The reality is that we are, in essence, cooperative, sharing, loving, caring, compassionate people, or should be. And that's the world that we should be fighting for. I actually love this forum tonight. I think it was great. I love the note that was struck. When we came in, there was this kind of rah-rah atmosphere, and it was fantastic to see such a great turnout of people interested in anarchism. Anarchism has a tremendous amount of analytical power. It's not just a vague body of theory, as Jonathan has pointed out. It's got real resonance and real power. And I think it's something we should be talking more and more about as the years and months go on. The next thing I want to say is this. Our next Politics in the Pub is a really important event for me and others. What the Ngara Institute is about is providing an intellectual space for people on the progressive side of politics to talk about issues. Anybody who talks about those issues in an erudite, respectful way is welcome to be on this stage and to be in our company. That is why Lee Rhiannon is coming. I know that Lee is perceived variously in different ways within this community and beyond as occupying a particular position within the Greens party. I'm not so much concerned about that, and nor is Lee for her presentation here when she comes on the 22nd November. What she's going to be talking about is her vision of a positive, progressive future. And I, for one, haven't heard that through all the noise in the media. I'm really, really looking forward to listening to what vision she actually has for a post-neoliberal future. I'm also really delighted to have, to finally invite on stage one of the most passionate advocates of social change we have in our community, and that's Dr. Liz Elliott, who'll be sharing the same stage as Lee Rhiannon. I really respect Liz, and I think she's a wonderful person, and I think she brings tremendous energy to this community, and I think without her this community would be a lesser place. The final thing I want to say is, look, if you're supporters of Ngara, by now you'd have had the third notice going out begging and pleading for money. We're really not doing that. What we're actually doing is actually inviting you to be part of the Ngara Institute, to help build this institute and to build these conversations into a national conversation, to make sure that down the track we have people who can appear on programmes like The Drum and other programmes, write articles for newspapers and represent the interests of progressive politics in Australia. To do that, we really need the money to employ a project worker and to employ a researcher. Without those resources, we can't achieve that. And I and my colleagues in Ngara are determined that we're going to achieve that end, because what Australia needs more than anything at this moment is a progressive voice right slap bang in the middle of the progressive frame, in the mainstream framework. So please help us. Look, it's $25 for concessions. It's $50 a year, which I can't do the maths, but it's kind of less than a cup of coffee a week. We've got Gilles Forget, our current project worker over there, I think taking names. So please consider doing that. It would really help us, and you'll be really supporting a positive cause. Finally, two bits of thanks. Sorry to keep you so long. The first is thanks for the events committee, to Sally, to the pub, to everybody who actually helped this evening. Thanks also very much to Judith White for her passionate reading of a beautiful poem. Thanks also to Narada for doing a fantastic job in filling in with the camera work. Much appreciated. And once again, thanks and congratulations to Jonathan, and thanks particularly for supporting Ngara. It's really important that we have academics like you helping us to push forward the progressive agenda. I really appreciate the way you talked about a very complex issue this evening, and certainly for me and others have provided a great deal of illumination on the issue of anarchism. So thank you so much. So thank you and good night.